Arphaxad had gone south, still defiantly alone, to bring back the body of his boy. An acquaintance wrote to them of his being down sick in Washington, prostrated by the heat and strange water, but even from his sickbed he had sent on orders to an undertaking firm out at the front, along with $100, their price in advance for embalming. Then, recovering, he had himself pushed down to headquarters, or as near them as civilians might approach, only to learn that he had passed the precious freight on the way. He posted back again, besieging the railroad officials at every point with inquiries, scolding, arguing, beseeching in turn, until at last he overtook his quest at Juneau Mills Junction, only a score of miles from home. Then only he wrote, telling people his plans. He came first to Octavius, where a funeral service was held in the forenoon, with military honors, the Wadsworths as the principal mourners, and a memorable turnout of distinguished citizens. The town hall was draped with mourning, and so was Alva's pew in the Episcopal Church, which he had deserted his ancestral Methodism to join after his marriage. Old Arphaxad listened to the novel burial service of his son's communion, and watched the clergyman in his curious white and black vestments with somber pride. He himself needed and desired only a plain and homely religion, but it was fitting that his boy should have organ music and flowers and a ritual. Dana Pillsbury had arrived in town early in the morning with the Grays, and a neighbor's boy had brought in the buggy. Immediately after dinner, Arphaxad had gathered up Alva's widow and little daughter and started the funeral cortege upon its final homeward stage. And so I saw them arrive on that July afternoon. Yea, for so good and patient a man, C. Humiston bore himself rather vehemently during the milking. It was hotter in the barn than it was outside in the sun, and the stifling air swarmed with flies, which seemed to follow Si perversely from stall to stall and settle on his cow. One beast put her hoofs square in his pail, and another refused altogether to give down, while the rest kept up a tireless slapping and swishing of their tails very hard to bear, even if one had the help of profanity. Marcellus and I listened carefully to hear him at last provoked to an oath, but the worst thing he uttered, even when the cow stepped in the milk, was, "Damn your buttons," which Marcellus said might conceivably be investigated by a church committee, but was hardly out-and-out swearing. I remember Si's groans and objurgations, his querulous, "Hist there, will ye?" his hypocritical, "So boss," his despondent, "They never will give down for me," because presently there was crossed upon this woof of peevish impatience the web of a curious conversation. C had been so slow in his headway against flapping tails and restive hoofs that, before he had got up to the end of the row, Aunt Em had finished her side. She brought over her stool and pail, and seated herself at the next cow to Humiston's. For a little, one heard only the resonant din of the stout streams against the tin. Then, as the bottom was covered, there came the ploughing plash of milk on milk, and C could hear himself talk. "S'pose you know Serenice come, 'long with your father," he remarked ingratiatingly. "I saw 'em drive in," replied M. "Whoa. Hist there. Hold still, can't ye? I didn't know if you quite made out who she was. You was scootin' along so fast. They ain't. Whoa, there. They ain't nothing the matter twixt you and her, is they?" "I don't know as there is," said M. curtly. "The world's big enough for both of us. We ain't no call to bunk into each other." "No, of course. Now you stop it. But it looked kinda curious to me, your picking off like that without waiting to say how to do. Of course I never had no relation by marriage that was stuck up at all or looked down on me. Stiddy there now, but I guess I can realize pretty much how you feel about it. I'm a good deal of a hand at that. It's what they call imagination. It's a gift, you know, like good looks or preaching or the knack o' making money. But you can't help what you're born with, can you? I'd been a heap better off if my gift been in some other direction, but, as I tell 'em, it ain't my fault. And my imagination." "Hi, there! Get over, will you? It's downright curious sometimes how it works. Now I could tell, you see, that you and Sreni didn't pull together. I suppose she never write a line to you when your husband was killed? Why should she? Demanded M. We never did correspond. What be the sense of beginning then? She minds her affairs, and I mind mine. Who wanted her to write? Oh, of course not, said Cy lightly. Probably you'll get along better together, though, now that you'll see more of one another. I suppose Srini's figuring on staying here right along now, her and her little girl. Well, it'll be nice for the old folks to have somebody they're fond of. They just worship the ground. Alvy walked on, and I suppose there won't be anything in this wide world too good for that little girl of his. Let's see, she must be coming on 3 now, ain't she? I don't know anything about her, snapped Aunt Em with emphasis. Of course it's natural the old folks should feel so, she being Alvy's child. I hain't noticed anything special, but does it? Well, I swan, hist there. Does it seem to you that they're as good to Marcellus quite as they used to be? I don't hear 'em sayin' nothing about his goin' to school next winter. Aunt Em said nothing, too, but milked doggedly on. Cy told her about the thickness and profusion of Serena's mourning, guardedly hinted at the injustice done him by not allowing him to go to the Red Barn with the others, speculated on the likelihood of the Wadsworths contributing to their daughter's support, and generally exhibited his interest in the family through a monologue which finished only with the milking, but Aunt Em made no response whatever. When the last pails had been emptied into the big cans at the door, Marcellus and I had let the cows out one by one into the yard as their individual share in the milking ended. Cy and M saw old Arphaxad wending his way across from the house to the Red Barn. He appeared more bent than ever, but he walked with a slowness which seemed born of reluctance even more than of infirmity. Well now, mused Cy aloud, Brother Turnbull and me's been friends for a good long spell. I don't believe he'd be mad if I cut over now to the Red Barn, too, seem the milkin's all out of the way. Of course I don't want to do what ain't right. What do you think now, honest? Think it'd rile him? I don't know anything about it, my aunt replied with increased vigor of emphasis. But for the land's sake, go somewhere. Don't hang around bothering me. I got enough else to think of besides your everlasting cackle. Thus rebuffed, Cy meandered sadly into the cow-yard, shaking his head as he came. Seeing us seated on an upturned plough over by the fence, from which point we had a perfect view of the Red Barn, he sauntered toward us and, halting at our side, looked to see if there was room enough for him to sit also. But Marcellus, in quite a casual way, remarked, "Oh," wheeled the milk over to the house, "already, see?" And at this the doleful man lounged off again in new despondency, got out the wheelbarrow and, with ostentatious groans of travail, hoisted a can upon it and started off. "He's taken advantage of our Faxed's being so worked up to play old soldier on him," said Marcellus. "All of us have to stir him up the whole time to keep him from taking root somewhere. I told him this afternoon if there had to be any settin' around under the bushes and cryin', the family'd do it." We talked in hushed tones as we sat there watching the shut doors of the Red Barn, in boyish conjecture about what was going on behind them. I recall much of this talk with curious distinctness, but candidly it jars now upon my maturer nerves. The individual man looks back upon his boyhood with much the same amused amazement that the race feels in contemplating the memorials of its own cave-dwelling or Bronze period. What strange savages we were! In those days, Marcellus and I used to find our very highest delight in getting off on Thursdays and going over to Dave Bushnell's slaughterhouse, to witness with stony hearts and from as close a coign of vantage as might be the slaying of some score of barnyard animals, the very thought of which now revolts our grown-up minds. In the same way we sat there on the plough and criticized old Arthakad's meanness in excluding us from the Red Barn, where the men folks were coming in final contact with the pride of the family. Some of the cows wandering toward us began to moo with impatience for the pasture, but Marcellus said there was no hurry. All at once we discovered that Aunt Em was standing a few yards away from us on the other side of the fence. We could see her from where we sat by, only turning a little, a motionless, stout, upright figure with a pail in her hand and a sternly impassive look on her face. She, too, had her gaze fixed upon the red barn and, though the declining sun was full in her eyes, seemed incapable of blinking, but just stared coldly straight ahead. Suddenly an unaccustomed voice fell upon our ears. Turning, we saw that a black-robed woman with a black wrap of some sort about her head had come up to where Aunt Em stood and was at her shoulder. Marcellus nudged me and whispered, "It's Srenny! Look out for squalls!" And then we listened in silence. "Won't you speak to me at all, Emmeline?" we heard this new voice say. Aunt Em's face, sharply outlined in profile against the sky, never moved. Her lips were pressed into a single line, and she kept her eyes on the barn. "If there's anything I've done, tell me," pursued the other. "In such an hour as this, when both our hearts are bleeding so, and every breath we draw is like a curse upon us, it doesn't seem a fit time for us to. The voice faltered and broke, leaving the speech unfinished. Aunt Em kept silence so long that we fancied this appeal, too, had failed. Then abruptly, and without moving her head, she dropped a few ungracious words, as it were, over her shoulder. "If I had anything special to say, most likely I'd say it," she remarked. We could hear the sigh that Serena drew. She lifted her shawled head and for a moment seemed as if about to turn. Then she changed her mind, apparently, for she took a step nearer to the other. "See here, Emmeline," she said in a more confident tone. "Nobody in the world knows better than I do how thoroughly good a woman you are, how you have done your duty, and more than your duty, by your parents and your brothers and your little stepson. You have never spared yourself for them day or night. I have said often, too, to him who has gone, that I didn't believe there was anywhere on earth a worthier or more devoted woman than you, his sister. And now that he is gone, and we are both more sisters than ever in affliction, why in heaven's name should you behave like this to me?" Aunt Em spoke more readily this time. "I don't know as I've done anything to you," she said in defense. "I've just let you alone, that's all, and that's doing as I'd like to be done by." Still she did not turn her head or lift her steady gaze from those closed doors. "Don't let us split words," entreated the other, venturing a thin white hand upon Aunt Em's shoulder. "That isn't the way we two ought to stand to each other. Why, you were friendly enough when I was here before. Can't it be the same again? What has happened to change it? Only today, on our way up here, I was speaking to your father about you and my deep sympathy for you, and—" Aunt Em wheeled like a flash. "Yes, Nan, what did he say?" "Come, don't make up anything. Out with it. What did he say?" She shook off the hand on her shoulder as she spoke. Gesture and voice and frowning vigor of mien were all so imperative and rough that they seemed to bewilder Serena. She, too, had turned now so that I could see her wan and delicate face, framed in the laced festoons of black, like the fabulous countenance of the Lady Inez in my mother's album of beauty. She bent her brows in hurried thought and began stammering. "Well," he said, "let's see," he said. "Why—" "Oh, yes," broke in Aunt Em with raucous irony. "I know well enough what he said. He said I was a good worker, that they'd never had to have a hired girl since I was big enough to wag a churn dash, and they wouldn't know what to do without me. I know all that. I've heard it on and off for 20 years. What I'd like to hear is, did he tell you that he went down south to bring back your husband, and that he never so much as give a thought to fetching my husband, who was just as good a soldier and died just as bravely as yours did? I'd like to know, did he tell you that?" What could Serena do but shake her head and bow it in silence before this bitter gale of words? "And tell me this too," Aunt Em went on, lifting her harsh voice mercilessly. "When you was settin' there in church this forenoon with the soldiers out and the bells tollin' and all that, did he say, 'This is some for Alvy and some for Abel who went to the war together and was killed together or within a month o' one another'? Did he say that, or look for one solitary minute as if he thought it? I'll bet he didn't." Serena's head sank lower still, and she put up, in a blinded sort of a way, a little white handkerchief to her eyes. "But why blame me?" she asked. Aunt Em heard her own voice so seldom that the sound of it now seemed to intoxicate her. "No!" she shouted. "It's like the Bible. One was taken and the other left. It was always Alvy this, and Alvy that, nothing for anyone but Alvy. That was all right, nobody complained. Probably he deserved it all, at any rate. We didn't begrudge him any of it while he was livin'. But there ought to be a limit somewhere. When a man's dead, he's pretty much about on an equality with other dead men, one would think. But it ain't so. One man gets hunted after when he's shot, and there's $100 for embalmin' him and a journey after him and bringin' him home and 2 big funerals and crape for his widow that'd stand by itself. The other man, he can lay where he fell. Them that's looking for the first one are right close by. It ain't more'n a few miles from the wilderness to Cold Harbor, so High Tuckerman tells me, and he was all over the ground 2 years ago. But nobody looks for this other man. Oh, no, nobody so much as remembers to think of him. They ain't no $100, no, not so much as 50 cents for embalmin' him. No, he could be shoveled in anywhere, or maybe burned up when the woods got on fire that night, the night of the 6th. They ain't no funeral for him, no bells tolled, unless it may be a cowbell up in the pasture that he hammered out himself. And his widow can go around, weekdays and Sundays, in her old calico dresses. Nobody ever mentions the word mourning crepe to her, or asks her if she'd like to put on black. I suppose they thought if they gave me the money for some mourning, I'd buy candy with it instead. With this climax of flaming sarcasm, Aunt Em stopped, her eyes aglow, her thick breast heaving in a flurry of breathlessness. She had never talked so much or so fast before in her life. She swung the empty tin pail now defiantly at her side to hide the fact that her arms were shaking with excitement. Every instant it looked as if she was going to begin again. Serena had taken the handkerchief down from her eyes and held her arms stiff and straight by her side. Her chin seemed to have grown longer or to be thrust forward more. When she spoke, it was in a colder voice, almost mincing in the way it cut off the words. "All this is not my doing," she said. "I am to blame for nothing of it. As I tried to tell you, I sympathize deeply with your grief. But grief ought to make people at least fair, even if it cannot make them gentle and soften their hearts. I shall trouble you with no more offers of friendship. I think I will go back to the house now, to my little girl." Even as she spoke, there came from the direction of the red barn a shrill creaking noise which we all knew. At the sound, Marcellus and I stood up, and Serena forgot her intention to go away. The barn doors, yelping as they moved on their dry rollers, had been pushed wide open. 4. The first one to emerge from the barn was Tuckerman. He started to make for the house, but when he caught sight of our group, came running toward us at the top of his speed, uttering incoherent shouts as he advanced and waving his arms excitedly. It was apparent that something out of the ordinary had happened. We were but little the wiser as to this something, when High had come to a halt before us and was pouring out a volley of explanations, accompanied by earnest grimaces and strenuous gestures. Even Marcellus could make next to nothing of what he was trying to convey, but Aunt Em, strangely enough, seemed to understand him. Still slightly trembling, and with a little occasional catch in her breath, she bent an intent scrutiny upon High, and nodded comprehendingly from time to time with encouraging exclamations. "He did, eh?" "Is that so? And I expected as much." Listening and watching, I formed the uncharitable conviction that she did not really understand High at all, but was only pretending to do so in order further to harrow Serena's feelings. Doubtless I was wrong, for presently she turned with an effort to her sister-in-law and remarked, "Perhaps you don't quite follow what he's saying." "Not a word," said Serena eagerly. "Tell me, please, Emmeline." Aunt Em seemed to hesitate. "He was shot through the mouth at Gaines's Mills, you know. That's right near Cold Harbor and the Wilderness," she said, obviously making talk. "That isn't what he's saying," broke in Serena. "What is it, Emmeline?" "Well," rejoined the other, after an instant's pause, "if you want to know, he says that it ain't Alvy at all that they've got there in the barn." Serena turned swiftly, so that we could not see her face. "He says it's some strange man," continued Em, "a yaller-headed man, all packed and stuffed with charcoal, so't his own mother wouldn't know him. Who it is, nobody knows, but it ain't Alvy." "They're a pack of robbers and swindlers," cried old Arphaxad, shaking his long gray beard with wrath. He had come up without our noticing his approach, so rapt had been our absorption in the strange discovery reported by High Tuckerman. Behind him straggled the boys and the hired men, whom C. Humiston had scurried across from the house to join. No one said anything now, but tacitly deferred to the old man's principal right to speak. It was a relief to hear that terrible silence of his broken at all. "They ought to all be hung," he cried, in a voice to which the excess of passion over physical strength gave a melancholy quaver. "I paid 'em what they asked. They took $100 of my money, and they ain't sent me him at all. There I went, at my age, all through the wilderness, almost clear to Cold Harbor, and that too getting up from a sick bed in Washington, and then hunting for the box at New York and Albany, and all the way back and holding a funeral over it only this very day. And here it ain't him at all. I'll have the law on him, though, if it costs the last cent I've got in the world. Poor old man. These weeks of crushing grief and strain had fairly broken him down. We listened to his fierce outpourings with sympathetic silence, almost thankful that he had left strength and vitality enough still to get angry and shout. He had been always a hard and gusty man. We felt by instinct, I suppose, that his best chance of weathering this terrible month of calamity was to batter his way furiously through it, in a rage with everything and everybody. "If there's any justice in the land," put in C. Humiston, "you'd ought to get your $100 back. I shouldn't wonder if you could, too, if you sued him afore a justice that was a friend of yours." "Why, the man's a fool," burst forth Arphaxad, turning toward him with a snort. "I don't want the $100. I wouldn't have begrudged 1,000, if only they'd dealt honestly by me. I paid 'em their own figure without beating 'em down a penny. If it had been double, I'd have paid it. What I wanted was my boy. It ain't so much their cheating me I mind, either, if it had been about anything else. But to think of Alvy, my boy, after all the trouble I took, and the journey, and my sickness there among strangers, to think that after it all he's buried down there, no one knows where, perhaps in some trench with private soldiers, shoveled in anyhow. Oh, oh, they ought to be hung." The two women had stood motionless, with their gaze on the grass. Aunt Em lifted her head at this. "If a place is good enough for private soldiers to be buried in," she said vehemently, "it's good enough for the best man in the army. On Resurrection Day, do you think them with shoulder straps will be called fussed and given all the front places? I reckon the men that carried a musket are every whit as good, there in the trench, as them that wore swords. They gave their lives as much as the others did, and the best man that ever stepped couldn't do no more." Old Arphaxad bent upon her a long look, which had in it much surprise and some elements of menace. Reflection seemed, however, to make him think better of an attack on Aunt Em. He went on instead with rambling exclamations to his auditors at large. "Making me the butt of the whole county," he cried. There was that funeral today with a parade and a choir of music and so on, and now it'll come out in the papers that it wasn't Alvy at all I brought back with me, but only some perfect stranger. By what you can make out from his clothes, not even an officer at all. I tell you, the war's a judgment on this country for its wickedness, for its cheating and robbing of honest men. There won't no sense in that battle at Cold Harbor anyway. Everybody admits that. It was murder and massacre in cold blood, 50,000 men mowed down and nothing gained by it, and then not even to get my boy's dead body back. I say hanging's too good for 'em. Yes, father, said Myron soothingly, but do you stick to what you said about the box? Wouldn't it look better? Tss. No, shouted Arphaxad with emphasis. Let Dana do what I told him. Take it down this very night to the poor master, and let him bury it where he likes. It's no affair of mine. I wash my hands of it. There won't be no funeral held here. It was then that Serena spoke. Strangely enough, old Arphaxad had not seemed to notice her presence in our group, and his jaw visibly dropped as he beheld her now standing before him. He made a gesture signifying his disturbance at finding her among his hearers, and would have spoken, but she held up her hand. Yes, I heard it all, she said in answer to his deprecatory movement. I am glad I did. It has given me time to get over the shock of learning our mistake, and it gives me the chance now to say something which I feel keenly. The poor man you have brought home was, you say, a private soldier. Well, isn't this a good time to remember that there was a private soldier who went out from this farm, belonging right to this family, and who, as a private, laid down his life as nobly as General Sedgwick or General Wadsworth, or even our dear Alva or anyone else? I never met Emmeline's husband, but Alva liked him and spoke to me often of him. Men who fall in the ranks don't get identified or brought home, but they deserve funerals as much as the others, just as much. Now, this is my idea. Let us feel that the mistake which has brought this poor stranger to us is God's way of giving us a chance to remember and do honor to Abel Jones. Let him be buried in the family lot up yonder where we had thought to lay Alva, and let us do it reverently in the name of Emmeline's husband and of all others who have fought and died for our country, and with sympathy in our hearts for the women who, somewhere in the north, are mourning, just as we mourn here for the stranger there in the red barn. Arphaxad had watched her intently. He nodded now and blinked at the moisture gathering in his old eyes. I could e'en a'most a thought it was Arvy talkin', was what he said. Then he turned abruptly, but we all knew, without further words, that what Serena had suggested was to be done. The menfolk, wondering doubtless much among themselves, moved slowly off toward the house or the cow barns, leaving the two women alone. A minute of silence passed before we saw Serena creep gently up to Aunt Em's side and lay the thin white hand again upon her shoulder. This time it was not shaken off, but stretched itself forward, little by little, until its palm rested against Aunt Em's further cheek. We heard the tin pail fall resonantly against the stones under the rail fence, and there was a confused movement as if the two women were somehow melting into one. "Come on, Sid," said Marcellus Jones to me. "Let's start them cows along. If there's anything I hate to see, it's women crying on each other's necks." The eve of the 4th. It was well on toward evening before this 3rd of July all at once made itself gloriously different from other days in my mind. There was a very long afternoon, I remember, hot and overcast, with continual threats of rain which never came to anything, The other boys were too excited about the morrow to care for present play. They sat instead along the edge of the broad platform stoop in front of Delos Ingersoll's grocery store, their brown feet swinging at varying heights above the sidewalk, and bragged about the manner in which they contemplated celebrating the anniversary of their independence. Most of the elder lads were very independent indeed. They were already secure in the parental permission to stay up all night so that the Fourth might be ushered in with its full quota of ceremonial. The smaller urchins pretended that they also had this permission, or were sure of getting it. Little Denny Cregan attracted admiring attention by vowing that he should remain out, even if his father chased him with a policeman all around the ward, and he had to go and live in a cave in the Gulf until he was grown up. My inferiority to these companions of mine depressed me. They were allowed to go without shoes and stockings. They wore loose and comfortable old clothes, and were under no responsibility to keep them dry or clean or whole. They had their pockets literally bulging now with all sorts of portentous engines of noise and racket, huge brown double-enders bound with waxed cord, long, slim, vicious-looking nigger chasers, big Union torpedoes covered with clay which made a report like a horse pistol, and were invaluable for frightening farmers' horses, and so on through an extended catalogue of recondite and sinister explosives upon which I looked with awe, as their owners from time to time exhibited them with the proud simplicity of those accustomed. Several of these boys also possessed toy cannons, which would be brought forth at twilight. They spoke firmly of ramming them to the muzzle with grass, to produce a greater noise, even if it burst them and killed everybody. By comparison, my lot was one of abasement. I was a solitary child and a victim to conventions. A blue necktie was daily pinned under my Byron collar, and there were gilt buttons on my zouave jacket. When we were away in the pasture playground near the Gulf, and I ventured to take off my footgear, every dry old thistle point in the whole territory seemed to arrange itself to be stepped upon by my whitened and tender soles. I could not swim, so, while my lithe, bold comrades dived out of sight under the deep water and darted about chasing one another far beyond their depth, I paddled ignobly around the baby hole, close to the bank, in the warm and muddy shallows. Especially apparent was my state of humiliation on this July afternoon. I had no double-enders, nor might hope for any. The mere thought of a private cannon seemed monstrous and unnatural to me. By some unknown process of reasoning, my mother had years before reached the theory that a good boy ought to have 2 10-cent packs of small firecrackers on the 4th of July. 4 or 5 succeeding anniversaries had hardened this theory into an orthodox tenet of faith, with all its observances rigidly fixed. The firecrackers were bought for me overnight and placed on the hall table. Beside them lay a long rod of punk. When I hastened down and out in the morning with these ceremonial implements in my hands, the hired girl would give me in an old kettle some embers from the wood fire in the summer kitchen. Thus furnished, I went into the front yard, and in solemn solitude fired off these crackers one by one. Those which, by reason of having lost their tails, were only fit for fizzes, I saved till after breakfast. With the exhaustion of these, I fell reluctantly back upon the public for entertainment. I could see the soldiers, hear the band and the oration, and in the evening, if it didn't rain, enjoy the fireworks. But my own contribution to the patriotic noise was always over before the breakfast dishes had been washed. My mother scorned the little paper torpedoes as flippant and wasteful things. "You merely threw one of them, and it went off," she said, "and there you were." I don't know that I ever grasped this objection in its entirety, but it impressed my whole childhood with its unanswerableness. Years and years afterward, when my own children asked for torpedoes, I found myself unconsciously advising against them on quite the maternal lines. Nor was it easy to budge the good lady from her position on the great 2-packs issue. I seem to recall having successfully undermined it once or twice, but 2 was the rule. when I called her attention to the fact that our neighbor, Tom Hemingway, thought nothing of exploding a whole pack at a time inside their wash boiler. She was not dazzled, but only replied, "Willful waste makes woeful want." Of course, the idea of the Hemingways ever knowing what want meant was absurd. They lived a dozen doors or so from us, in a big white house with stately white columns rising from veranda to gable across the whole front, and a large garden, flowers and shrubs in front, fruit trees and vegetables behind. Squire Hemingway was the most important man in our part of the town. I know now that he was never anything more than United States Commissioner of Deeds, but in those days, when he walked down the street with his gold-headed cane, his blanket shawl folded over his arm, and his severe, dignified, close-shaven face held well up in the air, I seemed to behold a companion of presidents. This great man had 2 sons. The elder of them, DeWitt Hemingway, was a man grown, and was at the front. I had seen him march away over a year before with a bright drawn sword at the side of his company. The other son, Tom, was my senior by only a 12-month. He was by nature proud, but often consented to consort with me when the selection of other available associates was at low ebb. It was to this Tom that I listened with most envious eagerness in front of the grocery store on the afternoon of which I speak. He did not sit on the stoop with the others. No one expected quite that degree of condescension, but leaned nonchalantly against a post, whittling out a new ramrod for his cannon. He said that this year he was not going to have any ordinary firecrackers at all. They, he added, with a meaning glance at me, were only fit for girls. He might do a little in double-enders, but his real point would be in ringers, an incredible giant variety of cracker, turkey red like the other, but in size almost a rolling pin. Some of these he would fire off singly, between volleys from his cannon, but a good many he intended to explode in bunches, say of 6, inside the tin wash boiler, brought out into the middle of the road for that purpose. It would doubtless blow the old thing sky high, but that didn't matter. They could get a new one. Even as he spoke, the big bell in the tower of the town hall burst forth in a loud clangor of swift repeated strokes. It was half a mile away, but the moist air brought the urgent, clamorous sounds to our ears as if the belfry had stood close above us. We sprang off the stoop and stood poised, waiting to hear the number of the ward struck, and ready to scamper off on the instant if the fire was anywhere in our part of the town. But the excited peal went on and on, without a pause. It became obvious that this meant something besides a fire. Perhaps some of us wondered vaguely what that something might be, but as a body our interest had lapsed. Billy Norris, who was the son of poor parents but could whip even Tom Hemingway, said he had been told that the German boys on the other side of the Gulf were coming over to rush us on the following day, and that we ought all to collect nails to fire at them from our cannon. This we pledged ourselves to do, the bell keeping up its throbbing tumult ceaselessly. Suddenly we saw the familiar figure of Johnson running up the street toward us. What his first name was I never knew. To everyone, little or big, he was just Johnson. He and his family had moved into our town after the war began. I fancy they moved away again before it ended. I do not even know what he did for a living. But he seemed always drunk, always turbulently good-natured, and always shouting out the news at the top of his lungs. I cannot pretend to guess how he found out everything as he did, or why, having found it out, he straightway rushed homeward, scattering the intelligence as he ran. Most probably Johnson was molded by nature for a town crier, but was born by accident some generations after the race of bellmen had disappeared. Our neighborhood did not like him, our mothers did not know Mrs. Johnson, and we boys behaved with snobbish roughness to his children. He seemed not to mind this at all, but came up unwearyingly to shout out the tidings of the day for our benefit. "Vicksburg's fell! Vicksburg's fell!" was what we heard him yelling as he approached. Delos Ingersoll and his hired boy ran out of the grocery. Doors opened along the street and heads were thrust inquiringly out. "Vicksburg's fell!" He kept hoarsely proclaiming, his arms waving in the air as he staggered along at a dog trot past us and went into the saloon next to the grocery. I cannot say how definite an idea these tidings conveyed to our boyish minds. I have a notion that at the time I assumed that Vicksburg had something to do with Gettysburg, where I knew, from the talk of my elders, that an awful fight had been proceeding since the middle of the week. Doubtless this confusion was aided by the fact that an hour or so later, on that same wonderful day, the wire brought us word that this terrible battle on Pennsylvanian soil had at last taken the form of a Union victory. It is difficult now to see how we could have known both these things on the 3rd of July, that is to say, before the people actually concerned seemed to have been sure of them. Perhaps it was only inspired guesswork, but I know that my town went wild over the news, and that the clouds overhead cleared away as if by magic. The sun did well to spread that summer sky at eventide with all the pageantry of color the spectrum knows. It would have been preposterous that such a day should slink off in dull Quaker drabs. Men were shouting in the streets now. The old cannon left over from the Mexican War had been dragged out onto the rickety-covered river bridge and was frightening the fishes and shaking the dry, worm-eaten rafters as fast as the swab and rammer could work. Our town bandsmen were playing as they had never played before, down in the square in front of the post office. The management of the universe could not hurl enough wild fireworks into the exultant sunset to fit our mood. The very air was filled with the scent of triumph, the spirit of conquest. It seemed only natural that I should march off to my mother and quite collectedly tell her that I desired to stay out all night with the other boys. I had never dreamed of daring to prefer such a request in other years. Now I was scarcely conscious of surprise when she gave her permission, adding with a smile that I would be glad enough to come in and go to bed before half the night was over. I steeled my heart after supper with the proud resolve that if the night turned out to be as protracted as one of those Lapland winter nights we read about in the geography, I still would not surrender. The boys outside were not so excited over the tidings of my unlooked-for victory as I had expected them to be. They received the news, in fact, with a rather mortifying stoicism. Tom Hemingway, however, took enough interest in the affair to suggest that, instead of spending my 20 cents in paltry firecrackers, I might go downtown and buy another can of powder for his cannon. By doing so, he pointed out, I would be a part proprietor, as it were, of the night's performance, and would be entitled to occasionally touch the cannon off. This generosity affected me, and I hastened down the long hill street to show myself worthy of it, repeating the instruction of Kentucky Bear Hunter, coarse grain, over and over again to myself as I went. Halfway on my journey, I overtook a person whom, even in the gathering twilight, I recognized as Miss Stratford, the schoolteacher. She also was walking down the hill, and rapidly. It did not need the sight of a letter in her hand to tell me that she was going to the post office. In those cruel war days, everybody went to the post office. I myself went regularly to get our mail, and to exchange shin plasters for 1-cent stamps with which to buy yeast and other commodities that called for minute fractional currency. Although I was very fond of Miss Stratford, I still recall her gentle eyes and pretty, rounded, dark face in its frame of long black curls with tender liking. I now coldly resolved to hurry past, pretending not to know her. It was a mean thing to do. Miss Stratford had always been good to me, shining in that respect in brilliant contrast to my other teachers, whom I hated bitterly. Still, the Kentucky Bear Hunter coarse grain was too important a matter to wait upon any mere female friendships, and I quickened my pace into a trot, hoping to scurry by unrecognized. "Oh, Andrew, is that you?" I heard her call out as I ran past. For the instant I thought of rushing on, quite as if I had not heard. Then I stopped and walked beside her. "I am going to stay up all night, Mother says I may, and I am going to fire off Tom Hemingway's big cannon every fourth time, straight through till breakfast time," I announced to her loftily. "Dear me! I ought to be proud to be seen walking with such an important citizen," she answered with kindly playfulness. She added more gravely after a moment's pause, "Then Tom is out, playing with the other boys, is he?" "Why, of course," I responded. "He always lets us stand around when he fires off his cannon. He's got some ringers this year, too." I heard Miss Stratford murmur an impulsive, "Thank God," under her breath. Full as the day had been of surprises, I could not help wondering that the fact of Tom's ringers should stir up such profound emotions in the teacher's breast. Since the subject so interested her, I went on with a long catalogue of Tom's other pyrotechnic possessions, and from that to an account of his almost supernatural collection of postage stamps. In a few minutes more I am sure I should have revealed to her the great secret of my life, which was my determination, in case I came to assume the victorious rule and rank of Napoleon, to immediately make Tom a marshal of the empire. But we had reached the post office square. I had never before seen it so full of people. Even to my boyish eyes, the tragic line of division which cleft this crowd in twain was apparent. On one side, over by the seminary, the youngsters had lighted a bonfire and were running about it, some of the bolder ones jumping through it in frolicsome recklessness. Close by stood the band, now valiantly thumping out John Brown's Body upon the noisy night air. It was quite dark by this time, but the musicians knew the tune by heart. So did the throng about them, and sang it with lusty fervor. The doors of the saloon toward the corner of the square were flung wide open. Two black streams of men kept in motion under the radiance of the big reflector lamp over these doors, one going in, one coming out. They slapped one another on the back as they passed, with exultant screams and shouts. Every once in a while, when movement was for the instant blocked, some voice lifted above the others would begin, "Hip, hip, hip, hip," and then would come a roar that fairly drowned the music. On the post office side of the square there was no bonfire. No one raised a cheer. A densely packed mass of men and women stood in front of the big square stone building with its closed doors and curtained windows upon which, from time to time, the shadow of some passing clerk, bareheaded and hurried, would be momentarily thrown. They waited in silence for the night mail to be sorted. If they spoke to one another, it was in whispers, as if they had been standing with uncovered heads at a funeral service in a graveyard. The dim light reflected over from the bonfire, or down from the shaded windows of the post office, showed solemn, hard-lined, anxious faces. Their lips scarcely moved when they muttered little low-toned remarks to their neighbors. They spoke from the side of the mouth, and only on one subject. "He went all through Fredericksburg without a scratch. He looks so much like me. General Palmer told my brother he'd have known his hide in a tan-yard. He's been gone. Let's see, it was a year sometime last April. He was counting on a furlough the 1st of this month. I suppose nobody got one as things turned out. He said, 'No, it ain't my style. I'll fight as much as you like, but I won't be nigger waiter for no man, captain or no captains.' Thus I heard the scattered murmurs among the grown-up heads above me as we pushed into the outskirts of the throng and stood there, waiting with the rest. There was no sentence without a he in it. A stranger might have fancied that they were all talking of one man. I knew better. They were the fathers and mothers, the sisters, brothers, wives of the men whose regiments had been in that horrible 3 days' fight at Gettysburg. Each was thinking and speaking of his own, and took it for granted the others would understand. For that matter, they all did understand. The town knew the name and family of every one of the 12 score sons she had in this battle. It is not very clear to me now why people all went to the post office to wait for the evening papers that came in from the nearest big city. Nowadays they would be brought in bulk and sold on the street before the mailbags had reached the post office. Apparently, that had not yet been thought of in our slow old town. The band across the square had started up afresh with Annie Lyle. The sweet old refrain of wave willows, murmur waters comes back to me now after a quarter century of forgetfulness, when all at once there was a sharp forward movement of the crowd. The doors had been thrown open, and the hallway was on the instant filled with a swarming multitude. The band had stopped as suddenly as it began, and no more cheering was heard. We could see whole troops of dark forms scudding toward us from the other side of the square. "Run in for me, that's a good boy. Ask for Dr. Stratford's mail," the teacher whispered, bending over me. It seemed an age before I finally got back to her with the paper in its postmarked wrapper buttoned up inside my jacket. I had never been in so fierce and determined a crowd before, and I emerged from it at last confused in wits and panting for breath. I was still looking about through the gloom in a foolish way for Miss Stratford when I felt her hand laid sharply on my shoulder. "Well, where is it? Did nothing come?" she asked, her voice trembling with eagerness, and the eyes which I had thought so soft and dove-like flashing down upon me as if she were Miss Pritchard and I had been caught chewing gum in school. I drew the paper out from under my roundabout and gave it to her. She grasped it and thrust a finger under the cover to tear it off. Then she hesitated for a moment and looked about her. "Come where there is some light," she said, and started up the street. Although she seemed to have spoken more to herself than to me, I followed her in silence close to her side. For a long way, the sidewalk in front of every lighted store window was thronged with a group of people clustered tight about someone who had a paper and was reading from it aloud. Beside broken snatches of this monologue we caught now groans of sorrow and horror, now exclamations of proud approval, and even the beginnings of cheers broken in upon by a general "shh" as we hurried past outside the curb. It was under a lamp in the little park nearly halfway up the hill that Miss Stratford stopped and spread the paper open. I see her still, white-faced, under the flickering gaslight, her black curls making a strange dark bar between the pale straw hat and the white of her shoulder shawl and muslin dress, her hands trembling as they held up the extended sheet. She scanned the columns swiftly, skimmingly for a time, as I could see by the way she moved her round chin up and down. Then she came to a part which called for closer reading. The paper shook perceptibly now as she bent her eyes upon it. Then all at once it fell from her hands, and without a sound she walked away. I picked the paper up and followed her along the gravelled path. It was like pursuing a ghost, so weirdly white did her summer attire now look to my frightened eyes, with such a swift and deathly silence did she move. The path upon which we were described a circle touching the four sides of the square. She did not quit it when the intersection with our street was reached, but followed straight round again toward the point where we had entered the park. This, too, in turn she passed, gliding noiselessly forward under the black arches of the overhanging elms. The suggestion that she did not know she was going round and round in a ring startled my brain. I would have run up to her now if I had dared. Suddenly she turned and saw that I was behind her. She sank slowly into one of the garden seats by the path and held out for a moment a hesitating hand toward me. I went up at this and looked into her face. Shadowed as it was, the change I saw there chilled my blood. It was like the face of someone I had never seen before, with fixed, wide-open, staring eyes which seemed to look beyond me through the darkness, upon some terrible sight no other could see. Go, run and tell Tom to go home, to go home. His brother has been killed," she said to me, choking over the words as if they hurt her throat, and still with the same strange, dry-eyed, far-away gaze, covering yet not seeing me. I held out the paper for her to take, but she made no sign, and I gingerly laid it on the seat beside her. I hung about for a minute or two longer, imagining that she might have something else to say, but no word came. Then, with a feebly inopportune, "Well, goodbye," I started off alone up the hill. It was a distinct relief to find that my companions were congregated at the lower end of the common instead of their accustomed haunt farther up near my home, for the walk had been a lonely one, and I was deeply depressed by what had happened. Tom, it seems, had been called away some quarter of an hour before. All the boys knew of the calamity which had befallen the Hemingways. We talked about it from time to time as we loaded and fired the cannon which Tom had obligingly turned over to my friends. It had been out of deference to the feelings of the stricken household that they had betaken themselves and their racket off to the remote corner of the common. The solemnity of the occasion silenced criticism upon my conduct in forgetting to buy the powder. "There would be enough as long as it lasted," Billy Norris said with philosophic decision. "We speculated upon the likelihood of DeWitt Hemingway's being given a military funeral. These mournful pageants had by this time become such familiar things to us that the prospect of one more had no element of excitement in it, save as it involved a gloomy sort of distinction for Tom. He would ride in the first mourning carriage with his parents, and this would associate us, as we walked along ahead of the band, with the most intimate aspects of the demonstration. We regretted now that the soldier company which we had so long projected remained still unorganized. Had it been otherwise, we would probably have been awarded the right of the line in the procession. Someone suggested that it was not too late, and we promptly bound ourselves to meet after breakfast next day to organize and begin drilling. If we worked at this night and day, and our parents instantaneously provided us with uniforms and guns, we should be in time. It was also arranged that we should be called the DeWitt C. Hemingway Fire Zouaves, and that Billy Norris should be side captain. The chief command would, of course, be reserved for Tom. We would specially salute him as he rode past in the closed carriage, and then fall in behind, forming his honorary escort. None of us had known the dead officer closely, owing to his advanced age. He was 7 or 8 years older than even Tom. But the more elderly among our group had seen him play baseball in the Academy 9, and our neighborhood was still alive with legends of his early audacity and skill in collecting barrels and dry goods boxes at night for election bonfires. It was remembered that once he carried away a whole front stoop from the house of a little German tailor on one of the back streets. As we stood around the heated cannon, in the great black solitude of the common, our fancies pictured this redoubtable young man once more among us. Not in his blue uniform, with crimson sash and sword laid by his side, and the gauntlets drawn over his lifeless hands, but as a taller and glorified Tom in a roundabout jacket and copper-toed boots, giving the law on this his playground. The very cannon at our feet had once been his. The night air became peopled with ghosts of his contemporaries, handsome boys who had grown up before us and had gone away to lay down their lives in far-off Virginia or Tennessee. These heroic shades brought drowsiness in their train. We lapsed into long silences, punctuated by yawns, when it was not our turn to ram and touch off the cannon. Finally, some of us stretched ourselves out on the grass in the warm darkness to wait comfortably for this turn to come. What did come instead was daybreak, finding Billy Norris and myself alone, constant to our all-night vow. We sat up and shivered as we rubbed our eyes. The morning air had a chilling freshness that went to my bones, and these, moreover, were filled with those novel aches and stiffnesses which beds were invented to prevent. We stood up, stretching out our arms and gaping at the pearl and rose beginnings of the sunrise in the eastern sky. The other boys had all gone home and taken the cannon with them. Only scraps of torn paper and tiny patches of burnt grass marked the site of our celebration. My first weak impulse was to march home without delay and get into bed as quickly as might be. But Billy Norris looked so finely resolute and resourceful that I hesitated to suggest this and said nothing, leaving the initiative to him. One could see by the most casual glance that he was superior to mere considerations of unseasonableness in hours. I remembered now that he was one of that remarkable body of boys, the paper carriers, who rose when all others were asleep in their warm nests and trudged about long before breakfast distributing the Clarion among the well-to-do households. This fact had given him his position in our neighborhood as quite the next in leadership to Tom Hemingway. He presently outlined his plans to me, after having tried the center of light on the horizon where soon the sun would be by an old brass compass he had in his pocket, a process which enabled him, he said, to tell pretty well what time it was. The paper wouldn't be out for nearly 2 hours yet, and if it were not for the fact of a great battle there would have been no paper at all on this glorious anniversary, but he thought we would go downtown and see what was going on around about the newspaper office. Forthwith we started. He cheered my faint spirits by assuring me that I would soon cease to be sleepy and would, in fact, feel better than usual. I dragged my feet along at his side, waiting for this revival to come, and meantime furtively yawning against my sleeve. Billy seemed to have dreamed a good deal during our nap on the common about the DeWitt C. Hemingway fire zouaves. At least he had now in his head a marvelously elaborated system of organization, which he unfolded as we went along. I felt that I had never before realized his greatness, his born genius for command. His scheme halted nowhere. He allotted offices with discriminating firmness. He treated the question of uniforms and guns as a trivial detail which would settle itself. He spoke with calm confidence of our offering our services to the Republic in the autumn. His clear vision was even the materials for a fife and drum corps among the German boys in the back streets. It was true that I appeared personally to play a meager part in these great projects. The most that was said about me was that I might make a fare of becoming intimate with Billy, that I made sure I should swiftly advance in rank. The more so as I discerned in the background of his thoughts, as it were, a grim determination to make short work of Tom Hemingway's aristocratic pretensions once the funeral was over. We were forced to make a detour of the park on our way down because Billy observed some half-dozen Irish boys at play with a cannon inside whom he knew to be hostile. If there had been only 4, he said, he would have gone in and routed them. He could whip any 2 of them, he added, with one hand tied behind his back. I listened with admiration. Billy was not tall, but he possessed great thickness of chest and length of arm. His skin was so dark that we canvassed the theory from time to time of his having Indian blood. He did not discourage this, and he admitted himself that he was double-jointed. The streets of the business part of the town into which we now made our way were quite deserted. We went around into the yard behind the printing office, where the carrier boys were wont to wait for the press to get to work, and Billy displayed some impatience at discovering that here, too, there was no one. It was now broad daylight, but through the windows of the composing room we could see some of the printers still setting type by kerosene lamps. We seated ourselves at the end of the yard on a big, flat, smooth-faced stone, and Billy produced from his pocket a number of quads, so he called them, and with which the carriers had learned from the printers' boys to play a very beautiful game. You shook the pieces of metal in your hands and threw them on the stone. Your score depended upon the number of nicked sides that were turned uppermost. We played this game in the interest of good fellowship for a little. Then Billy told me that the carriers always played it for pennies, and that it was unmanly for us to do otherwise. He had no pennies at that precise moment, but would pay at the end of the week what he had lost. In the meantime, there was my 20 cents to go on with. After this, Billy threw so many nicks uppermost that my courage gave way, and I made an attempt to stop the game, but a single remark from him as to the military destiny which he was reserving for me If I only displayed true soldierly nerve and grit, sufficed to quiet me once more, and the play went on. I had now only 5 cents left. Suddenly a shadow interposed itself between the sunlight and the stone. I looked up to behold a small boy with bare arms and a blackened apron standing over me, watching our game. There was a great deal of ink on his face and hands, and a hardened, not to say rakish expression in his eye. "Why don't you Jeff with somebody of your own size?" he demanded of Billy, after having looked me over critically. He was not nearly so big as Billy, and I expected to see the latter instantly rise and crush him, but Billy only laughed and said we were playing for fun, he was going to give me all my money back. I was rejoiced to hear this, but still felt surprised at the propitiatory manner Billy adopted toward this diminutive inky boy. It was not the demeanor befitting a side captain, and what made it worse was that the strange boy loftily declined to be cajoled by it. He sniffed when Billy told him about the military company we were forming. He coldly shook his head with a curt "Nixie" when invited to join it, and he laughed aloud at hearing the name our organization was to bear. "He ain't dead at all. That DeWitt Hemingway," he said with jeering contempt. "Hain't he, though?" exclaimed Billy. "The news come last night. Tom had to go home. His mother sent for him, on account of it." "I'll bet you a quarter he ain't dead," responded the practical inky boy. "Money up, though." "I've only got 15 cents. I'll bet you that, though," rejoined Billy, producing my torn and disheveled shin plasters. "All right, wait here," said the boy, running off to the building and disappearing through the door. There was barely time for me to learn from my companion that this printer's apprentice was called the Devil, and could not only whistle between his teeth and crack his fingers, but chew tobacco when he reappeared, with a long, narrow strip of paper in his hand. This he held out for us to see, indicating with an ebon forefinger the special paragraph we were to read. Billy looked at it sharply for several moments in silence. Then he said to me, "What does it say there?" "I got some powder in my eyes last night." I read this paragraph aloud, not without an unworthy feeling that the inky boy would now respect me deeply. Correction. Lieutenant DeWitt C. Hemingway of Company A. Sue us uninjured. The officer killed is Lieutenant Carl Heininge, Company F, same regiment. Billy's face visibly lengthened as I read this out, and he felt us both looking at him. He made a pretense of examining the slip of paper again, but in a half-hearted way. Then he ruefully handed over the 15 cents and, rising from the stone, shook himself. "Them Dutchmen never was no good," was what he said. The inky boy had put the money in the pocket under his apron, and grinned now with as much enjoyment as dignity would permit him to show. He did not seem to mind any longer the original source of his winnings, and it was apparent that I could not, with decency, recall it to him. Some odd impulse prompted me, however, to ask him if I might have the paper he had in his hand. He was magnanimous enough to present me with the proof sheet on the spot. Then, with another grin, he turned and left us. Billy stood sullenly kicking with his bare toes into a sand heap by the stone. He would not answer me when I spoke to him. It flashed across my perceptive faculties that he was not such a great man, after all, as I had imagined. In another instant or two it had become quite clear to me that I had no admiration for him whatever. Without a word, I turned on my heel and walked determinedly out of the yard and into the street, homeward bent. All at once I quickened my pace. Something had occurred to me. The purpose thus conceived grew so swiftly that soon I found myself running. Up the hill I sped, and straight through the park. If the Irish boys shouted after me, I knew it not, but dashed on heedless of all else save the one idea. I only halted, breathless and panting, when I stood on Dr. Stratford's doorstep and heard the night bell inside jangling shrilly in response to my excited pull. As I waited, I pictured to myself the old doctor as he would presently come down, half-dressed and pulling on his coat as he advanced. He would ask eagerly, "Who is sick? Where am I to go?" And I would calmly reply that he unduly alarmed himself, and that I had a message for his daughter. He would, of course, ask me what it was, and I, politely but firmly, would decline to explain to anyone but the lady in person. Just what might ensue was not clear, but I beheld myself throughout commanding the situation, at once benevolent, polished, and inexorable. The door opened with unlooked-for promptness, while my self-complacent vision still hung in mid-air. Instead of the bald and spectacled old doctor, there confronted me a white-faced, solemn-eyed lady in a black dress whom I did not seem to know. I stared at her, tongue-tied, till she said in a low, grave voice, "Well, Andrew, what is it?" Then, of course, I saw that it was Miss Stratford, my teacher, the person whom I had come to see. Some vague sense of what the sleepless night had meant in this house came to me as I gazed confusedly at her mourning and heard the echo of her sad tones in my ears. "Is someone ill?" she asked again. "No, someone is very well," I managed to reply, lifting my eyes again to her wan face. The spectacle of its drawn lines and pallor all at once assailed my wearied and overtaxed nerves with crushing weight. I felt myself beginning to whimper, and rushing tears scalded my eyes. Something inside my breast seemed to be dragging me down through the stoop. I have now only the recollection of Miss Stratford's kneeling by my side with a supporting arm around me, and of her thus unrolling and reading the proof paper I had in my hand. We were in the hall now instead of on the stoop, and there was a long silence. Then she put her head on my shoulder and wept. I could hear and feel her sobs as if they were my own. I didn't think you'd cry, that you'd be so sorry," I heard myself saying at last, in despondent self-defense. Miss Stratford lifted her head and, still kneeling as she was, put a finger under my chin to make me look her in her face. "Lo!" The eyes were laughing through their tears. The whole countenance was radiant once more with the light of happy youth, and with that other glory which youth knows only once. "Why, Andrew, boy," she said, trembling, smiling, sobbing, beaming all at once, "didn't you know that people cry for very joy sometimes?" And as I shook my head, she bent down and kissed me. My Aunt Susan, my Aunt Susan. I held the lamp, while Aunt Susan cut up the pig. The whole day had been devoted, I remember, to preparations for this great event. Early in the morning I had been to the butcher's to set in train the annual negotiations for a loan of cleaver and meat-saw, and hours afterward had borne these implements proudly homeward through the village street. In the interval I had turned the grindstone over at the four corners while the grocer's hired man obligingly sharpened our carving knife. Then there had been the even more back-aching task of clearing away the hard snow from the accustomed site of our woodpile in the yard, and scraping together a frosted heap of chips and bark for the smudge in the smoke barrel. From time to time I sweetened this toil, and helped the laggard hours to a swifter pace, by paying visits to the woodshed to have still another look at the pig. He was frozen very stiff, and there were small icicles in the crevices whence his eyes had altogether disappeared. My emotions, as I viewed his big, cold, pink carcass, with its extended legs, its bland and pasty countenance, and that awful emptiness underneath, were much mixed. Although I was his elder by 7 or 8 years, we had been close friends during all his life, or all except a very few weeks of his earliest sucking piehood, spent on his native farm. I had fed him daily, I had watched him grow week by week. More than once I had poked him with a stick as he ran around in his sty, to make him squeal for the edification of neighbors' boys who had come into our yard and would now be sharply ordered out again by Aunt Susan. As these kindly memories surged over me, I could not but feel like a traitor to my old companion as he lay thus hairless and pallid before my eyes. But then I would remember how good he was going to be to eat, and straightway return with a light heart to the work of kicking up more chips from the ice. From the living room in the rear of our little house came the monotonous, incessant clatter of Aunt Susan's carpet loom. Through the window I could see the outlines of her figure and the back of her head as she sat on her high bench. It was to me the most familiar of all spectacles, this tireless woman bending resolutely over her work. She was there when I first cautiously ventured my nose out from under the warm blanket of a winter's morning. Very, very often I fell asleep at night in my bed in the recess, lulled off by the murmur of the diligent loom. Presently I went in to warm myself, and stood with my red fingers over the stove-top. She cast but one vague glance at me, through the open frame of the loom between us, and went on with her work. It was not our habit to talk much in that house. She was too busy a woman, for one thing, to have much time for conversation. The impression that she preferred not to talk was always present in my boyish mind. I call up the picture of her still as I saw her then, under the top bar of the cumbrous old machine, sitting with lips tight together and resolute, masterful eyes bent upon the twining intricacy of warp and woof before her. At her side were piled a dozen or more big balls of carpet rags, which the village wives and daughters cut up, sewed together, and wound in the long winter evenings, while the menfolk sat with their stockinged feet on the stove hearth, and read out the latest news from the front in their weekly Tribune. I knew all these rag balls by the names of their owners. Not only did I often go to their houses for them, upon the strength of the general village rumor that they were ready and always carry back the finished lengths of carpet, but I had long since unconsciously grown to watch all the varying garments and shifts of fashion in the raiment of our neighbors, with an eye single to the likelihood of their eventually turning up at Aunt Susan's loom. When Hiram Maybe's checkered butternut coat was cut down for his son Roswell, I noted the fact merely as a stage of its progress toward carpet rags. If Mrs. Wilkins concluded to turn her flowered delaine dress a third year, or Sarah Northrop had her bright saffron shawl dyed black, I was sensible of a wrong having been done our little household. I felt like crossing the street whenever I saw approaching the portly figure of Cyrus Husted's mother, the woman who dragged everybody into her house to show them the ingrain carpet she had bought at Tecumseh, and assured them that it was much cheaper in the long run than the products of my aunt's industry. I tingled with indignation as she passed me on the sidewalk, puffing for breath and stepping mincingly because her shoes were too tight for her. Nearly all the knowledge of our neighbors' sayings and doings which reached Aunt Susan came to her from me. She kept herself to herself with a vengeance, toiling early and late, rarely going beyond the confines of her yard, save on Sunday mornings when we went to church, and treating with frosty curtness the few people who ventured to come to our house on business or from social curiosity. For one thing, this Juneau Mills in which we lived was not really our home. We had only been there for 4 or 5 years, a space which indeed spanned all my recollections of life, but left my aunt more or less a stranger and newcomer. She spared no pains to maintain that condition. I can see now that there were good reasons for this stern aloofness. At the time, I thought it was altogether due to the proud and unsociable nature of my aunt. In my child's mind, I regarded her as distinctly an elderly person. People outside, I know, spoke of her as an old maid, sometimes winking furtively over my head as they did so. But she was not really old at all, was in truth just barely in the 30s. Doubtless the fact that she was tall and dark with very black hair, and that years of steady concentration of sight upon the strings and threads of the loom had scored a scowling vertical wrinkle between her near-sighted eyes, gave me my notion of her advanced maturity. And in all her ways and words, too, she was so far removed from any idea of youthful softness. I could not remember her having ever kissed me. My imagination never evolved the conceit of her kissing anybody. I had always had at her hands uniformly good treatment, good food, good clothes, after I had learned my letters from the old maroon plush label on the Babbitt's soap box which held the wood behind the stove, and expanded this knowledge by a study of street signs. She had herself taught me how to read, and later provided me with books for the village school. She was my only known relative, the only person in the world who had ever done anything for me. Yet it could not be said that I loved her. Indeed, she no more raised the suggestion of tenderness in my mind than did the loom at which she spent her waking hours. "The Perkinses asked me why you didn't get the butcher to cut up the pig," I remarked at last, rubbing my hands together over the hot stove griddles. "It's none of their business," said Aunt Susan with laconic promptness. "And Devilo Pollard's got a new overcoat," I added. "He hasn't worn the old army one now for upward of a week." "If this war goes on much longer," commented my aunt, "every carpet in Dearborn County'll be as blue as a whetstone." I think that must have been the entire conversation of the afternoon. I especially recall the remark about the overcoat. For 2 years now, the balls of rags had contained an increasing proportion of pale blue woolen strips as the men of the country round about came home from the South or bought cheap garments from the second-hand dealers in Tecumseh. All other colors had died out. There was only this light blue and the black of bombazine or worsted mourning into which the news in each week's papers forced one or another of the neighboring families. To obviate this monotony, some of the women dyed their white rags with butternut or even cochineal, but this was a mere drop in the bucket, so to speak. The loom spun out only long, depressing rolls of black and blue. My memory leaps lightly forward now to the early evening when I held the lamp in the woodshed and Aunt Susan cut up the pig. How joyfully I watched her every operation. Every now and again my interest grew so beyond proper bounds that I held the lamp sidewise and the flames smoked the chimney. I was in mortal terror over this lamp even when it was standing on the table quite by itself. We often read in the paper of explosions from this new kerosene by which people were instantly killed and houses wrapped in an unquenchable fire. Aunt Susan had stood out against the strange invention, long after most of the other homes of Juneau Mills were familiar with the idea of the lamp. Even after she had yielded, and I went to the grocery for more oil and fresh chimneys and wicks, like other boys, she refused to believe that this inflammable fluid was really squeezed out of hard coal, as they said. And for years we lived in momentary belief that our lamp was about to explode. My fears of sudden death could not, however, for a moment stand up against the delighted excitement with which I viewed the dismemberment of the pig. It was very cold in the shed, but neither of us noticed that. My aunt attacked the job with skillful resolution and energy, as was her way, chopping small bones, sawing vehemently through big ones, hacking and slicing with the knife, like a strong man in a hurry. For a long time no word was spoken. I gazed in silence as the head was detached, and then resolved itself slowly into souse, always tacitly set aside as my special portion. In prophecy I saw the big pan filled with ears, cheeks, snout, feet, and tail, all boiled and allowed to grow cold in their own jelly, that pan to which I was free to repair any time of day until everything was gone. I thought of myself, too, with apron tied round my neck and the chopping bowl on my knees, reducing what remained of the head into small bits to be seasoned by my aunt, and then fill other pans as head cheese. The sage and summer savory hung in paper flour bags from the rafters overhead. I looked up at them with rapture. It seemed as if my mouth already tasted them in head cheese and sausage, and in the hot gravy which basted the succulent spare rib. Only the abiding menace of the lamp kept me from dancing with delight. Gradually, however, as my aunt passed from the tidbits to the more substantial portions of her task, getting out the shoulders, the hams for smoking, the pieces for salting down in the brine barrel, my enthusiasm languished a trifle. The lamp grew heavy as I changed it from hand to hand, holding the free fingers at a respectful distance over the chimney top for warmth, and shuffling my feet about. It was truly very cold. I strove to divert myself by smiling at the big shadow my bustling aunt cast against the house side of the shed, and by moving the lamp to affect its proportions, but broke out into yawns instead. A mouse ran swiftly across the scantling just under the lean-to roof. At the same time I thought I caught the muffled sound of distant rapping, as if at our own rarely used front door. I was too sleepy to decide whether I had really heard a noise or not. All at once I roused myself with a start. The lamp had nearly slipped from my hands, and the horror of what might have happened frightened me into wakefulness. The Perkins girls keep on calling me wise child. They yell it after me all the while, I said, desperately clutching at a subject which I hoped would interest my aunt. I had spoken to her about it a week or so before, and it had stirred her quite out of her wonted stern calm. If anything would induce her to talk now, it would be this. "They do, eh?" she said, with an alert sharpness of voice which dwindled away into a sigh. Then, after a moment, she added, "Well, never you mind. You just keep right on tending to your own affairs and studying your lessons, and in time it'll be you who can laugh at them and all their low-down lot. They only do it to make you feel bad. Just don't you humor them." "But I don't see," I went on. "Why, what do they call me wise child for?" I asked Hi Bud up at the corners, but he only just chuckled and chuckled to himself and wouldn't say a word. My aunt suspended work for the moment and looked severely down upon me. "Well, Ira Clarence Blodgett," she said with grim emphasis, "I am ashamed of you. I thought you had more pride. The idea of talking about things like that with a coarse, rough hired man in a barn." To hear my full name thus pronounced, syllable by syllable, sent me fairly weltering, as it were, under Aunt Susan's utmost condemnation. It was the punishment reserved for my gravest crimes. I hung my head and felt the lamp wagging nervelessly in my hands. I could not deny even her speculative impeachment as to the barn. It was blankly apparent in my mind that the fact of the barn made matters much worse. "I was helping him wash their two-seated sleigh," I submitted weakly. "He asked me to." "What does that matter?" she asked peremptorily. "What business have you got going around talking with men about me?" "Why, it wasn't about you at all, Aunt Susan," I put in more confidently. "I said the Perkins girls kept calling me wise child, and I asked, 'Hi!'" Aunt Susan sighed once more and interrupted me to inspect the wick of the lamp. Then she turned again to her work, but less spiritedly now. She took up the cleaver with almost an air of sadness. "You don't understand yet," she said, "but don't make it any harder for me by talking. Just go along and say nothing to nobody. People will think more of you." My mind strove in vain to grapple with this suggested picture of myself, moving about in perpetual dumbness, followed everywhere by universal admiration. The lamp would not hold itself straight. All at once we both distinctly heard the sound of footsteps close outside. The noise of crunching on the dry, frozen snow came through the thin clapboards with sharp resonance. Aunt Susan ceased cutting and listened. "I heard somebody rapping at the front door a spell ago," I ventured to whisper. My aunt looked at me and probably realized that I was too sleepy to be accountable for my actions. At all events, she said nothing, but moved toward the low door of the shed, cleaver in hand. "Who's there?" She called out in shrill, belligerent tones, and this demand she repeated after an interval of silence when an irresolute knocking was heard on the door. We heard a man coughing immediately outside the door. I saw Aunt Susan start at the sound, almost as if she recognized it. A moment later this man, whoever he was, mastered his cough sufficiently to call out in a hesitating way, "Is that you, Susan?" Aunt Susan raised her chin on the instant, her nostrils drawn in, her eyes flashing like those of a pointer when he sees a gun lifted. I had never seen her so excited. She wheeled round once and covered me with a swift, penetrating, comprehensive glance under which my knees smote together and the lamp lurched perilously. Then she turned again, glided toward the door, halted, moved backward 2 or 3 steps, looked again at me, and this time spoke. "Well, I swan," was what she said, and I felt that she looked it. "Susan, is that you?" came the voice again, hoarsely appealing. It was not the voice of any neighbor. I made sure I had never heard it before. I could have smiled to myself at the presumption of any man calling my aunt by her first name if I had not been too deeply mystified. "I've been directed here to find Miss Susan Pike," the man outside explained between fresh coughings. "Well then, mog your boots out of this as quick as ever you can." My aunt replied with great promptitude, "You won't find her here." "But I have found her," the stranger protested with an accent of wearied deprecation. "Don't you know me, Susan? I am not strong. This cold air is very bad for me." "I say, get out," my aunt replied sharply. Her tone was unrelenting enough, but I noted that she had tipped her head a little to one side, a clear sign to me that she was opening her mind to argument. I felt certain that presently I should see this man. And sure enough, after some further parley, Susan went to the door and, with a half-defiant gesture, knocked the hook up out of the staple. "Come along then, if you must," she said in scornful tones. Then she marched back till she stood beside me, angry resolution written all over her face and the cleaver in her hand. A tall, dark figure, opaque against a gleaming background of moonlight and snowlight, was what I for a moment saw in the frame of the open doorway. Then, as he entered, shut and hooked the door behind him, and stood looking in a dazed way over at our lamp-lit group, I saw that he was a slender, delicately featured man with a long beard of yellowish-brown and gentle eyes. He was clad as a soldier, heavy azure-hued caped overcoat and all, and I already knew enough of uniforms, cruel familiarity of my wartime infancy, to tell by his cap that he was an officer. He coughed again before a word was spoken. He looked the last man in the world to go about routing up peaceful households of a winter's night. "Well, now, what is your business?" demanded Aunt Susan. She put her hand on my shoulder as she spoke, something I had never known her to do before. I felt confused under this novel caress, and it seemed only natural that the stranger, having studied my aunt's face in a wistful way for a moment, should turn his gaze upon me. I was truly a remarkable object, with Aunt Susan's hand on my shoulder. I could make no one hear at the other door. I saw the light through the window here and came around, the stranger explained. He sent little straying glances at the remains of the pig and at the weapon my aunt held at her side, but for the most part looked steadily at me. "That doesn't matter," said Aunt Susan coldly. "What do you want now that you are here? Why did you come at all? What business had you to think that I ever wanted to lay eyes on you again? How could you have the courage to show your face here, in my house?" The man's shoulders shivered under their cape, and a wan smile curled in his beard. "You keep your house at a very low temperature," he said with grave pleasantry. He did not seem to mind Aunt Susan's hostile demeanor at all. "I was badly wounded last September," he went on, quite as if that was what she had asked him, "and lay at the point of death for weeks. Then they sent me north, and I have been in the hospital at Albany ever since. One of the nurses there, struck by my name, asked me if I had any relatives in her village, that is, Juneau Mills. In that way I learned where you were living. I suppose I ought not to have come. Against doctor's orders. The journey has been too much. I have suffered a good deal these last 2 hours. I felt my aunt's hand shake a little on my shoulder. Her voice, though, was as implacable as ever. "There is a much better reason than that why you should not have come," she said bitterly. The stranger was talking to her, but looking at me. He took a step toward me now, with a softened sparkle in his eyes and an outstretched hand. This then is the boy, is it?" he asked. With a gesture of amazing swiftness, Aunt Susan threw her arm about me and drew me close to her side, lamp and all. With her other hand she lifted and almost brandished the cleaver. "No, you don't," she cried. "You don't touch him. He's mine. I've worked for him day and night ever since I took him from his dying mother's breast." I closed her eyes. I forgave her. Blood is thicker'n water, after all. She was my sister. Yes, I forgave poor Emmeline, and I kissed her before she died. She gave the boy to me, and he's mine. Mine, do you hear? Mine. "My dear Susan," our visitor began. "Don't dear Susan me. I heard it once too often. Oh, never again. You left me to run away with her. I don't speak of that. I forgave that when I forgave her, but that was the least of it. You left her to herself for months before she died. You've left the boy to himself ever since. You can't begin now. I've worked my fingers to the bone for him. You can't make me stop now. I went to California," he went on in a low voice, speaking with difficulty. "We didn't get on together as smoothly as we might, perhaps, but I had no earthly notion of deserting her. I was ill myself, lying in yellow fever quarantine off Key West, at the very time she died. When I finally got back, you and the child were both gone. I could not trace you. I went to the war. I had made money in California. It is trebled now. I rose to be colonel. I have a brigadier's brevet in my pocket now. Yet I give you my word, I never have desired anything so much, all the time, as to find you again, you and the boy." My aunt nodded her head comprehendingly. I felt from the tremor of her hand that she was forcing herself against her own desires to be disagreeable. "Yes, that war," was what she said. "I know about that war. The honest men that go get killed. But you come back." The man frowned wearily and gave a little groan of discouragement. "Then this is final, is it? You don't wish to speak with me. You really desire to keep the boy. You are set against my ever seeing him, touching him. Why, then, of course, excuse my—" And then for the first time I saw a human being tumble in a dead swoon. My little brain, dazed and bewildered by the strange new things I was hearing, lagged behind my eyes in following the sudden pallor on the man's face, lagged behind my ears in noting the telltale quaver and gasp in his voice. Before I comprehended what was toward, lo! There was no man standing in front of me at all. Like a flash, Aunt Susan snatched the lamp from my grasp and flung herself upon her knees beside the limp and huddled figure. After a momentary inspection of the white, bearded face, she set the lamp down on the frozen earth floor and took his head upon her lap. "Take the lamp, run to the buttery, and bring the bottle of hartshorn," she commanded me hurriedly. "Or, no, wait, open the door. That's it, walk ahead with the light." The strong woman stood upright as she spoke, her shoulders braced against the burden she bore in her arms. Unaided, with slow steps, she carried the senseless form of the soldier into the living room and held it without rest of any sort, the while I, under her direction, wildly tore off quilts, blankets, sheets, and feather tick from my bed and heaped them up on the floor beside the stove. Then, when I had spread them to her liking, she bent and gently laid him down. "Now get the hartshorn," she said. I heard her putting more wood on the fire, but when I returned with the file, she sat once again with the stranger's head upon her knee. She was softly stroking the fine, waving brown hair upon his brow, but her eyes were lifted, looking dreamily at faraway things. I could have sworn to the beginnings of a smile about her parted lips. It was not like my Aunt Susan at all. "Come here, Ira," I heard her say at last, after a long time had been spent in silence. I walked over and stood at her shoulder, looking down upon the pale face upturned against the black of her worn dress. The blue veins just discernible in temples and closed eyelids, the delicately turned features, the way his brown beard curled, the fact that his breathing was gently regular once more. These are what I saw, but my aunt seemed to demand that I should see more. "Well?" she asked, in a tone mellowed beyond all recognition. Don't you see who it is?" I suppose I really must have had an idea by this time, but I remember that I shook my head. My aunt positively did smile this time. "The Perkins girls were wrong," she said. "There isn't the least smitch of a wise child about you." There was another pause. Emboldened by consciousness of a change in the emotional atmosphere, I was moved to lay my hand upon my aunt's shoulder. The action did not seem to displease her, and we remained thus for some minutes watching together this strange addition to our family party. Finally, she told me to get on my cap, comforter, and mittens, and run over to Dr. Peabody's and fetch him back with me. The purport of my mission oppressed me. "Is he going to die, then?" I asked. Aunt Susan laughed outright. "You little goose," she said. "Do you think the doctors kill people every time?" And, laughing again with a trembling softness in her voice and tears upon her black eyelashes, she lifted her face to mine and kissed me. No fatality dogged good old Dr. Peabody's big footsteps through the snow that night. I fell asleep while he was still at my aunt's house, but not before the stranger had recovered consciousness and was sitting up in the large rocking chair, and it was clearly understood that he was soon to be well again. The kindly, garrulous doctor did more than reassure our little household. He must have spent most of the night going about reassuring the other households of Juneau Mills. At all events, when I first went out next morning, while our neighbors were still eating their buckwheat cakes and pork fat by lamplight, everybody seemed to know that my father, the distinguished Colonel Blodgett, had returned from the war on sick leave and was lying ill at the house of his sister-in-law. I felt at once the altered attitude of the village toward me. Important citizens who had never spoken to me before, dignified and portly men in blue cutaway coats with brass buttons and high stiff hats of shaggy white silk, stopped now to lay their hands on the top of my head and ask me how my father, the colonel, was getting along. The grocer's hired man gave me a Jackson ball and 2 molasses cookies the very first time I saw him. Even the Perkins girls, during the course of the afternoon, strolled over to our front gate and, instead of hurling enigmatic objurgations at me, invited me to come out and play. The butcher of his own accord came and finished cutting up the pig. These changes came back to me as one part of the great metamorphosis which the night's events had wrought. Another part was the definite disappearance of the stern-faced, tirelessly toiling old maid I had known all my life as Aunt Susan. In her place there was now a much younger woman, with pleasant lines about her pretty mouth and eyes that twinkled when they looked at me, and who paid no attention to the loom whatever, but bustled cheerily about the house instead, thinking only of good things for us to eat. I remember that I marked my sense of the difference by abandoning the old name of Aunt Susan and calling her now just Auntie. And one day in the mid-spring, after she and her convalescent patient had returned from their first drive together into the country round about, she told me, as she took off her new bonnet in an absent-minded way and looked meditatively at the old disused loom, and then bent down to brush my forehead with her warm lips, she told me that henceforth I was to call her mother. new novels and short stories in uniform binding, each $1, a pound of cure, by W. H. Bishop, a striking novel of life at Monte Carlo. It embodies a curious picture of the growth of the gambling spirit upon a young married man whose only fault is his weakness in the presence of alluring pleasure. In addition to the very remarkable plot, the book is noteworthy for the delicate and picturesque descriptions of the scenery around Monte Carlo. Mr. Bishop's easy and very accurate English style adds to the effectiveness of the book as a work of art. Salem Kittredge and Other Stories by Bliss Perry. Salem Kittredge is a story about a theological student, a pretty girl with active sympathies, and a young man addicted to drink. How these